Hi, everybody. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast, again, back with another article review. In today's article, what I want to look at is the topic of measurement of performance in sports. Specifically, what are we supposed to do with all the things we're measuring, right? We have so much capacity now to measure so many aspects of sports performance, kinetics, the forces you can generate with things like force plates, kinematics, using motion tracking to measure the angles of your body joint positions, the torques you can generate, things like measuring velocity, bat speed, all these kind of things. And as I discussed with someone on Twitter a few weeks ago, right, measuring things is easy, right? It's becoming cheaper and cheaper and more effective to be able to measure things about sports performance. The more challenging question is, what do we do with all these numbers? How do we use that to actually improve performance and support skill acquisition and skill development? And that's what I want to focus on today, looking at this article. And specifically, I want to focus on biomechanics, right? So in biomechanics, we can measure, use for motion tracking and force plates, for example, measure a whole bunch of things about a pitcher's delivery. We could create a forward model, like a biomechanics model, which relates all the joint angles and torques and velocities to the outcome, the pitch velocity. What do we do with that? How do we use that information to guide a learner, a pitcher, to get better, right? Or to develop the technique? There's three different ways. And by the way, this is an issue I discussed back in episode 307 of the podcast. You could also look at, there's a couple journal clubs associated with this. What I did, I talked about some of Paul Glazer's work, who will feature in this today. And also I had a couple journal clubs where I talked to people who are developing technologies to support this, Mike Son and a group from Panther Tech. So you might want to check out that episode if you're interested in this topic. So there's three different ways I think we could use this, right? One is we could use biomechanics to identify the one correct technique, right? And for example, what angles are your arms supposed to be in, what the different foot positions, and so on, in the pitching delivery, and use that to give you feedback, right? So give feedback to a pitcher, nope, your elbow's bent too far, etc., and so on. Hopefully by now, if you've watched enough of my content, you know that I'm going to disagree with that strongly, right? There is no one optimal technique, right? There is no one way to do anything, right? So we're not going to do that. Instead, what we've moved to more, and if you accept kind of the ecological approach, is that there's an optimal technique there is an optical technique, but it's different for everyone, right? Depends on their individual constraints, right? The way in which they can throw the hardest is different for different people. So a second alternative is we could use a biomechanics to support you reaching your optimal technique. So we could use a biomechanical model to try to predict what's the optimal technique for you based on some of your individual constraints, and then give you feedback to try to get to that optimal technique, right? So our model could say, elbow should be bent 45 degrees. Your elbow's too bent, so we give you feedback about that, right? So that's the actual one I want to focus on today, right, in the paper today. The third one is probably going to be the best answer, right? And this is the one that Paul Glazer, as I said, talks about, is instead of trying to identify and give you feedback about the optimal technique, is help support your own search for finding, admitting that we probably can't identify it no matter what we can measure. We can't identify your own optimal technique, but we can help you guide your search for it. And in particular, we can give you what's called transition feedback, right? Which is a concept Newell came up with that I've talked about a few times on the podcast. That the idea transition feedback is not feedback about how you're doing now. It's feedback about how your search is going, whether the change you've made is moving you towards a better performance, right? So I'll talk about more about that in the future. But today I want to focus on the second one. Can we achieve this one? Can we identify an optimal technique for an individual performer and help them get there? So here, as I said, what we're talking about, if we put this in the constraints model, we're talking about in this individual optimization, right? So we're not trying to find the one correct technique. What we're going to do is trying to measure some of the individual organismic constraints of a performer and identify the optimal technique for them, right? So individual optimization. So the paper I want to talk about is one that came out last year by Felton and colleagues in the Journal of Sports Science. A really interesting paper looking at cricket bowling, right? So they're looking at cricket bowling and how they can optimize that for an individual performer. So what they wanted to do was they took measurements from one high level cricket bowler, right? And they're going to develop a model, right? That biomechanics model that can describe how the body positions relate to the velocity of the ball as it leaves their hand, right? In particular, they were focused on the front foot contact phase, so the front foot hitting the ground, right? And what they want to do is develop a model that is consistent with a real performance of this bowler, then tweak the parameters to find out how they can potentially optimize their bowling delivery. So that was the kind of the aim of the study. So the actual methods, they had a one bowler from the English and Wales Cricket Bowl. He was a fast bowler. If you know about cricket, there's different types of bowlers. Some of them do more equivalent, almost equivalent to baseball pitching. People use, fastballs versus off speed. So this was a fast bowler. They motion tracked them with Viacom cameras and markers all over the body. They had a force plate to measure the contact point and things like that. They had them throw 12 deliveries. So this is the information going to be used in the model, right? They're going to have the delivery. To make this individually optimized, what they did was to do a bunch of different measurements. They measured body lengths, length of the arm, different anthropomorphic measurements. But more importantly, they also did measurements of torque and inertia. So they used this device shown in that picture called a dynamometer, uh, that I remember using when I was in the sports science department in Birmingham. We could play around with this in labs and things. But basically, it measures. You sit in this machine and you can put different body parts. You can measure how much torque you can generate. So it's a measure of action capacity of the performer, right? So it's really getting at some of the nice individual constraints. So I really like that part. How quickly can you extend your ankle or your elbow and so on. So they took all this information, right, and they put it into a biomechanics model. And I'm not going to go into detail. It's a quite complex model, right? They go into a lot of description of how they came up with the different things. But basically, in the model, there's 16 body segments, right, that are linked. And you can sort of see it in the picture. The model incorporates kind of elastic and spring components to it. So it's a very advanced biomechanics model. Within this model, they input those subject specific parameters, right? What's the maximum torque you can generate, so on, how long is your arm segment? And what the model outputs is the positions and joint configurations, the force you generate, the ground reaction force when you land, for example, and you push off. And most importantly, the key performance parameter we're going to look at is the release velocity. How fast is the ball going when it leaves your hand? And obviously, just like baseball and other sports and cricket, the harder you can throw, the better. It gives the hitter less time, right? So you want to try to optimize that if you can, obviously, without hurting yourself and making sure you still have control, right? So that's the basic idea. They're going to do this biomechanics. So as I said, they're going to take the data from the pitcher, develop the model, see how well it matches to the pitcher's delivery. Then they're going to tweak the parameters and see if they could potentially make the person throw harder. Okay. So the first thing, if they look at the results, they looked at the fit between the model generated parameters and the actual parameters. And you can't really see these, but these are the angle over time for the different body parts, right? Ankle, knee, shoulder, hip, and so on. And I don't know if you can make it out. The solid black line was the actual performance of the cricket bowler, what they actually did. The crosses, the X's, are the model predicted, right? So you can see they're a very good fit. The dash line there is I'll talk about in a second, is the optimized one, right? And you would expect that to be different because the optimized one is going to suggest changes essentially to the delivery to make the bowling faster. But you can see there was a really good fit, and they did some statistics to show the fit. So the model seems to be quite good, a model of what's actually going on with the delivery. They also represented this visually with these kind of models, animated skeletons. Sometimes they're called, right. This is the different phases of the bowling delivery. If you examine this closely in the paper, this is the top one is the actual performance. The bottom one is the model prediction of what the model outputs, and it's really hard to see any differences at all in these two. Right. So the bottom line, the model seems to be quite a good fit. What about the optimization? So as I said, what they did was once they established this model as a good model of actual cricket bowling, they went through a bunch of procedures to change parameters and see what that would do to the velocity, the pitch, the throw velocity, right? And so they tweaked a bunch of things that they weren't completely, they had principled tweaks to them. They also made sure that they were reasonable, like didn't produce ridiculous angles that a bowler could never produce. And what they found was there were some things that they could change from the bowler's actual delivery that could potentially give them more velocity. In particular, these things, keeping extension longer, keeping the hip more extended, right? Occurring the shoulder extension later. Okay, so these little small adjustments, right? And in that picture, the top one is the actual delivery. The bottom one is the optimized delivery. And you can see, for example, there are very subtle changes, of course, right? And the biggest difference you can see is with their non-throwing hand, right? Is clearly in a different position when the ball is released because of those things mentioned, the later shoulder rotation, things like that, right? So the bottom line is they made the model predicted that if you do these small tweaks to the delivery, then you'll get higher velocity. And so from that, when you run that through the model, what it predicts is that making these changes will increase ball velocity by about 10%, right? So in terms of actual speed, that's about an 8 mile an hour increase in pitching delivery. If I could map this onto baseball for me, anyone that knows baseball, that's an enormous increase, right? People go crazy when a pitcher increases their velocity by 1 or 2 miles an hour from one season to the next. To go up by 8 miles an hour is an enormous jump, right? A 10% increase, right? That's if you pitch 90 miles an hour going up to 99, that's a huge jump, right? You'd suddenly get a lot of people very interested in you. Interestingly for me, the model also changed the ground reaction forces. In particular, it increases the horizontal reaction force, which without changing the vertical. One of the things I really like about the paper is if you read it, they have logic and they go into why. They try to understand why those changes would really lead to increased pitch velocity. And I really like the idea that what all these changes are essentially doing is they're making the movement break. So when you throw, you essentially want to generate from the ground reaction forces, you want to generate forward movement, then you want to break it, right? You want to stop it so that it creates this angular momentum. When you release the ball, right? So you want to stop your body to maximize the angular momentum. And so you need efficient brakes in the delivery. And what they're essentially showing is that's what these changes are achieving, right? And as I said, as I said in those pictures, in the model, they show you what actually changes in terms of the graph, and the pictures you can see, as I said, they're very, very subtle changes. Okay, so this is really interesting, and it's important to point out that they made these predictions. They didn't actually obviously test it on the real person, the real bowler. And that's kind of the next step, right, in this and the challenge. And it also raises an important limitation in this study. So this goes back to my original question I started this video with. Okay, now we know these little tweaks that we could make to make that bowler, this one individual bowler, throw harder. How can we actually give them that information? What can we do with that? Can we actually make them implement these changes, right? It's obviously way easier said than done. And one of the problems that they're going to likely run into, so they didn't do that in the study, but interesting to see if they did. Obviously, we get into issues of focus of attention, what kind of instructions, what constraints. So how you do it would be a huge challenge. But imagine that we could come up with a good method to instruct you. One of the key problems, and I said that Paul Glazier has pointed out a few times, is though there's a lot more to the individual constraints, right, that determine what the optimal solution is for me versus you than just your body mass, your length of your arm, and your capacity, the torque you can generate. In particular, the issue is one of intrinsic dynamics, right? So Paul had this. We were talking about this on Twitter a few weeks ago, and Paul had this great quote. He post. So I wanted to say it. So learning has been characterized as the molding and sculpting of intrinsic dynamics. So really, you need to know the layout of the attractors and the malleability of the attractor landscape to know what coordination patterns are possible. So what we mean by this is not only do we have individual body part lengths and mass and individual capacities, the forces we can generate, the velocity, but we also have individual coordination tendencies, right? Those are what are called intrinsic dynamics. We tend to organize our degrees of freedom in certain ways, right? And I discussed this back in episode 311. I talked about the research on this, looking at interlimb coordination. So you see that some people are attracted to certain phases, for example, in that study. Other people are attracted to other phases. So that is what we mean by intrinsic dynamics, right? You have specific coordination tendencies that you tend to go to, you tend to self-organize to. So we may not be able to so what we're essentially doing when we're giving you a new pattern of coordination, we're adding it on top of this tendency that already exists. That's what Paul meant by molding and sculpting. We're trying to change what already exists. So depending on whether this already exists, we may or may not be able to get you to adopt that new, even if it sounds great that it will help increase pitch velocity. Depending on where you're starting, your intrinsic dynamics, we need to know that to know whether or not it's possible to implement this new technique, right? And that's a key thing that's missing from a lot of technique chains and things. We need to understand where you're coming from, your intrinsic dynamics, to know whether you can get to this optimal solution. So that's a real challenge in this individual. So the bottom line is this individual optimization is a nice idea, and the model, I think that's a great first step in showing that the model can predict and seemingly reasonable changes in the delivery. Getting you to adopt them is going to be a next huge step that may or may not, likely is not going to be very effective. We have to see, right? As I said, because of this problem of intrinsic dynamics. But it's an interesting study nonetheless. And as I said, if you want more information, there's a couple episodes where I cover these kind of things in intrinsic dynamics in that specific episode. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks for joining me, and keep them coupled.